1609 and 1610, Ravaillac made 3 separate trips to Paris, each time determined to get an audience with His Majesty in order to try and share his divine vision and get Henry IV to crack down on the Protestants within France. But try as he might, Ravaillac is unable to actually meet with his king, and this failure drives him deeper into madness. He interprets Henry's unwillingness to meet with him as proof that the king is actually his enemy, and when a war breaks out between France and Catholic Spain, Ravaillac has all the evidence he needs to satisfy his mind that the French king is no friend to Catholics. Since Ravaillac is unable to get the king to listen to reason, there's only one option left. He'll have to take matters into his own hands, and it doesn't
You're duller than a broken sandwich.
take long for Mr. Ravaillac to get his chance. On the 14th of May, 1610, he lays in wait as the king's carriage passes through the Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris, and to his amazement, the carriage is forced to halt due to an unexpected blockage in the street. He takes it as another message, that this blockage is nothing other than a sign from God, that Ravaillac is to take care of the king personally. Whilst the royal attendants attempt to clear a path through the street, Ravaillac makes a dash towards the static cabin, hops over the wheel of the carriage, and just like that, he's inside the king's chamber. But he hasn't just bought words. Instead, this time he brandishes a dagger, which he quickly plunges into the torso of the defenseless king. To quote the chronicler Père de l'Osteya, Ravaillac climbed on the wheel of the coach and, with a knife trenchant on both sides, stabbed the king between the second and third ribs. Ravaillac was immediately arrested, and fearing that the Parisian mob may try and lynch him on the spot, he's whisked away to the conciergerie, a large courthouse where they can properly deal with him. According to the court records, when Ravaillac was questioned about his guilt, he immediately confessed, saying, "I know very well he is dead. I saw the blood on my knife and the place where I hit him. But I have no regrets at all about dying, because I've done what I came to do." This assassin was now about to face the most brutal of recriminations, as the French authorities scrambled to try and discover whether or not there were any more accomplices in the conspiracy. Although he swore that he was acting alone, his captors were not convinced, and so it was decided that he be subjected to torture in order to loosen his tongue. It was ordered that he be tortured by a form of the boots, and in the case of Ravaillac, it was a particularly nasty contraption known as the brodequin. It's essentially just a three-sided box designed to fit snugly around the victim's legs, at which point ropes were used to tighten the whole thing into the wooden casing so that the victim couldn't move and their lower legs were under excruciating pressure. With this, the torturer would place a wedge of wood between the knees of the victim and then drive the wedges home with a hammer, forcing the wood between the tightly bound legs, scraping away flesh and skin, before they're finally driven all the way down, resting between the ankle balls of the victim. This would obviously create a crushing sensation, as the tightly bound legs are forced to accommodate a block of wood inside the brodequin and the extreme pressure. This was after just one wedge had been driven home, and for serious crimes, up to 8 wedges could be used on the victim, which would essentially render the legs unrecognizable and, of course, unusable. I don't need to emphasize the incredible pain that this would cause for the victim, as the wedges are driven into the ultrafine gap between the legs, so tightly bound that the torture hand must use a two-handed hammer in order to drive them downwards. Ravaillac was able to endure the first wedge without much complaint, but as his captors placed the second wedge between his kneecaps, he began to break his composure. The mallet came down nonetheless, and a sickening crack within the legs would have echoed through the chamber as the blood pooled at his feet and the knees and ankles started to be dislocated and crushed out of place. As the mallet was risen up once more to drive the second wedge home, Ravaillac screamed to his captors, "I am a sinner, but I know no more than I have declared. By the truth I owe to God and the court, all I can say, I have already declared. I beseech the court not to drive my soul into despair." The torture, however, continued, and Ravaillac was unable to name any fellow conspirators, probably because he had been acting alone. By the third or fourth wedge, the kneecap itself would be entirely dislocated, the muscle, fat and skin of the shins would have been almost completely stripped away, and the tibia and fibula would have been utterly destroyed, causing bone marrow to ooze down his feet. The ankle ball itself also would be completely crushed under the blunt trauma and agonizing pressure within the brodequin. Nonetheless, Ravaillac remained resolute, and in the end, the court decided that no further torture should be used. He never named another accomplice, and it was deemed that he would be executed on the 27th of May 1610, around 2 weeks after his arrest. The injuries he sustained during his interrogation were so extreme that when he was finally put to death, he was unable to walk even a step towards his execution site and was instead carried to the gallows. There, he would be hanged, drawn and quartered, which is described by the historian Alistair Horn in the following words. Before being drawn and quartered, he was scalded with burning sulphur, molten lead and boiling oil and resin, his flesh then being torn by pincers. So Ravaillac had certainly paid for his attempt on the king's life, and although his story was over, the story of the boots would continue. Around 150 years later, another Frenchman determined to kill their king, this time a man named Robert Francois d'Amiens, was also executed in much the same way, and during his ordeal, another form of the boots was used, this time though, not as part of the interrogation, but instead as part of the punishment itself, for no reason other than to inflict further suffering. In Damiens' case, instead of having his legs tied together inside a brodequin, he had individual feet inserted into cast iron boots, at which point the same process of wedging was employed, driving down chunks of wood into the gap between the leg and the inside of the boot, utterly crushing the shin and foot within until blood and bone marrow began to ooze out of the top of the boot. We're not sure about the case of Damiens specifically, but in some cases, the boot itself would be applied while it was red hot, searing the flesh before the crushing began, and inflaming the dermis around the area, allowing for the wedges to effectively glove the skin off the foot completely. Like Ravaillac, Damiens was also tormented with sulphur, picked at with red-hot pincers, and finally hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the boots weren't unique to France, or to this time period. One particularly grim incarnation comes as early as 10th century Scotland, although the process here was a bit different. Instead of crushing the foot inside a case with wedges, the foot and lower leg would instead be wrapped tightly with wet rawhide before being placed over a gentle fire. As the rawhide dries up and gets hot, it contracts rapidly and aggressively, causing the tight-fitting garment over the foot to squeeze with incredible force. There are 26 bones in the human foot, including a clump of floating bones behind the metatarsals. This extreme pressure would cause the shape of the foot to crush, squeezing out the loose bones with a pop, like bread jumping from a toaster. Permanent disfigurement would be an expected consequence, as the bones of the foot fuse themselves back together in this unnatural position. As if this didn't sound bad enough, it's also worth considering that there's a large concentration of nerves between the metatarsals, meaning that any pressure which squeezes these bones together could easily result in nerve impingement, as the sensitive pain receptors are ground between the crushed bones. This, by the way, happens often to cyclists today and is known as hot foot, where the pressure and shape of the bicycle pedal causes the bones within the foot to squeeze together and pinch the nerves between them. Hot foot is, of course, an extremely painful condition to endure, and I'll let you imagine the torment when it's taken to its absolute limit, as the rawhide contracts around a foot with the force to dislocate entire sections of the skeletal structure. Of course, this wouldn't kill you by design, the point was to inflict pain, but in the long term, it could certainly be dangerous, since the crushing process could easily inflict damage onto the blood supply to the foot, and because feet spend lots of time inside shoes or getting dirty, infection was a common after effect, and the development of gangrene could often mean death, or at the very least, total amputation. Brutal as this is, though, it's a form of torture that can be seen more or less everywhere at some point. In India, a version of the boots consisted of nothing more than 2 boards strapped to either side of a victim's foot before being gradually tightened, first completely obliterating the ankle and then finally crushing inwards until the entire foot is ground to pulp. Again, in Imperial China, you have jiagun, another crushing process by which the feet are placed between boards of wood which are progressively tightened until the feet are crushed and unusable. But don't be thinking the boots are just about crushing. Human cruelty and creativity would know no bounds, and there's another kind of torture for the feet hailing from Autun in eastern France, in which boots are made from a spongy, porous leather and then drawn over the victim's feet and legs before boiling water was poured over those boots, eventually soaking through the leather and eating into the legs and feet of the victim forced to wear them. Another variation is to physically weld a pair of metal boots onto a sturdy floor and then force a prisoner to either stand or sit in them and then restrain them so they cannot withdraw their feet. Then, once they're locked in within their metal cases, boiling water could be poured into the boots, steaming the feet within. For particularly heinous crimes, Or if the torture master had exhausted his patience, the water could be replaced instead with boiling fat, which would immediately hit the foot with a punishing sizzle before proceeding to completely fry the flesh trapped within. In any case, victims who underwent this kind of torture would never properly recover and would be left permanently disfigured as a result of the punishment. Sometimes this was the point, in order to send a message to others who are considering stepping out of line, but oftentimes it was pointless suffering, designed to extract information that didn't exist, such as the case of Francois Ravaillac, who endured the most unimaginable crushing, only for the authorities to change their mind and have him tortured to death anyway. This frenzy of crushing and frying would eventually subsist over the 18th century, and by the 19th century most European governments more or less abolished judicial torture, although it did occasionally rear its ugly head. The most widespread use of torture to the feet that still exists today is known as bastinado, in which the victim's feet are tied together before being struck multiple times with a cane or a metal rod, which is much more painful than it sounds due to the high concentration of nerves at the base of the feet and the fact that you'd be unable to walk during your recovery. It is still practiced in some parts of the Middle East and Africa today, although thankfully its use is in decline, but it has been known to reappear, particularly during interrogations, when a confession is needed from the victim, and it's sometimes used as a tool of discipline within prisons in order to punish those who step out of line. Sadly, it would seem that for as long as there's a part of the body to hurt and something to hurt it with, us humans will never really change, especially when it can all be licensed under the pretense of justice. In October 401 BC, the King of Kings, Artaxerxes II, stood off against the rebel force led by his own brother, Cyrus the Younger, at the Battle of Cunaxa on the banks of the river Euphrates. The young Cyrus, just 22 years old, had amassed an army of Greek mercenaries around 14,000 strong, with which he hoped to overthrow his older brother and take the throne for himself. In response, Artaxerxes met Cyrus with a number over twice his size, perhaps as many as 40,000 strong. Heavily outnumbered, the battle turns against Cyrus, and in a last-ditch effort to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the younger brother makes a daring charge directly at Artaxerxes' camp. But Cyrus's moment of valor is suddenly cut short when he's struck with a javelin, which kills him instantly. The man who threw this javelin would go down in history as Mithridates, the man who suffered possibly the worst fate in all of history, a process known today as the boats. But how did this soldier of King Artaxerxes come to find himself subject to this gruesome fate? And what makes the boats so bad? To answer that, we need to pick up where we left off. So, Cyrus the Younger had been slain at the Battle of Cunaxa, and as we know, it was Mithridates who had struck him down. After Cyrus was killed, his rebel forces melted away, and Artaxerxes had been able to successfully put down the uprising and secure his position on the throne. Not only that, but his rival claimant was now dead for good, and he had Mithridates to thank for it. Initially, Artaxerxes was extremely pleased with Mithridates and showered him with gold and promotions for his valiant service. But all of this favour and wealth came on one condition. Mithridates was never to speak aloud that he had killed Cyrus the Younger. The honour of this great deed was to go to King Artaxerxes personally. Unfortunately for Mithridates, his discretion was not as good as his aim, and during the feast to celebrate the battle, he started drunkenly boasting that it was none other than him who had sunk the javelin into Cyrus's chest. This ran directly against the story that King Artaxerxes had told his guests, and as a result, the king was exposed as a liar who had stolen Mithridates' valour. For this act of open disobedience, and for the crime of embarrassing the crown, Mithridates was sentenced to death by scaphism. It was, and perhaps still is, the worst execution method in history, and the process would take not minutes, not hours, not even days. Mithridates' death would take 2.5 weeks to carry out, and each moment would be pure and utter agony. At first, the whole thing actually doesn't sound that bad. In fact, some people have even gone on to call it death by milk and honey, which almost sounds appealing, but as the process unfolds, the horror comes to light. It all begins by taking a small boat and then placing the victim inside so that their hands, feet and head are able to protrude out of the sides, and then an equally sized boat is placed on top, creating a kind of capsule over the body with the extremities dangling outside. Once the victim was properly fastened between the two boats, they wouldn't be able to move, and so they would be stuck in this position for the entirety of the execution, which, let's not forget in Mithridates' case, was 17 days. Now, here's where things get nasty. We're going to quote the Greek historian Plutarch, who covers the process in quite some detail. So, setting them together that the head, hands and feet of him are left outside and the rest of the body lies shut up within, they then proceed by forcing him to ingest a mixture of milk and honey before pouring all over his face and body. And it's the milk and honey that turned this from a simple case of death by starvation, dehydration or exposure into something absolutely grotesque. You see, milk and honey are extremely rich foods, which means that a small amount can keep someone alive for a pretty long time and, when consumed in abundance, can lead to diarrhea and nausea. Of course, to borrow Shakespeare's words, the sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, and in the taste confounds the appetite. In other words, this would quickly become a very unpleasant thing to have to consume, and the sources tell us that before long, the victims would have trouble actually keeping this mixture down, to quote Plutarch again. They gave him this food, and if he refused to eat, they forced it down his throat by prying open his mouth with reeds. And again, they would absolutely stuff the victim with so much of this that the victim would become nauseous and their belly would swell with milk and honey. Now, you might be thinking, that's actually not that bad, being force-fed, until that same mixture would then be poured onto the hands, feet and face, meaning that those exposed limbs would begin to attract all manner of insects, flies, wasps, bees, and even some nastier stuff we'll get into later. You can imagine the discomfort of having sweet milk and sticky honey slowly harden and bake onto your skin in the punishing heat as you laid on your back under the brutal Persian sun. The 12th century chronicler Zonaras also details the process, and again, to quote him, "This is repeated every day, the effect being that flies, wasps and bees, attracted by the sweetness, settle on his face and all such parts of him as project outside the boats, and miserably torment and sting the wretched man." So, at this stage, the victim is being force-fed milk and honey, and his hands, feet and face are crawling with all manner of creepy crawlies. And yeah, it's unpleasant stuff, but it's not really a worst death in history caliber of suffering. And that's all about to change once we take a look at what's happening inside the boats. Now, remember, the victim is strapped between the two boats and unable to move, which means that when it's time for all of this indulgent grub to come back out, it all ends up inside the boat that you are strapped into whilst laying on your back, essentially turning the whole thing into a septic tank with you inside. And since the victim's diet is just milk and honey, the waste they produce would be abundant, watery, and absolutely stinking as it hotboxes in the 40-degree Persian sun. Plutarch tells us that in the case of Mithridates, this is more or less exactly how things went down. Quote, "Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed." For those who didn't quite catch Plutarch's rather vague language, he's telling us that the conditions inside the boat, which, let's not forget, are basically a septic tank by now, are absolutely perfect for all kinds of insects and infections to breed like crazy. And that's what kills him. Slowly, though, let's remember Mithridates lasts 17 days. Plutarch doesn't actually specify what any of these creeping things and vermin are, but with modern-day knowledge, we can take a pretty good guess at what exactly would be going down within the boats. See, first you've got open wounds, raw or exposed flesh, and an abundance of feces, or urine. Then you've got the constant feeding and the residue of this milk and honey, which causes fermentation and attracts more pests and insects. Zonaras mentions that the stomach itself becomes distended, which basically just means bloated, and on top of all that, you've got no movement within the boats, nor any circulation of fresh air within. So it all starts to kind of rot and decompose as the whole display is left to bake in the sun. To quote Zonaras again, his belly, distended as it is with milk and honey, throws off liquid excrements, and these putrefying breed swarms of worms, intestinal and of all sorts. He would have, quite literally, been eaten alive in slow motion from the inside out and from the outside in. And although it was his fellow man who put Mithridates in this position, it would be nature herself that would do the hard lifting. Flesh flies and blowflies would have been first to arrive, attracted by the smell of rotting flesh. These would lay eggs in the open wounds and in the excrement, which would later hatch into maggots. As an interesting side note, modern forensic entomology actually uses these specific types of fly to be able to determine an estimated time of death for corpses. Anyway, these eggs would then hatch as maggots, which would eat through everything they could, and would of course be everywhere, in the mouth, the nose, the ears, the orifices of the body that were within the boats, and any open wounds, and they would also likely be floating around in the slush that was gathering within the chamber. Modern studies show that some maggots can eat through the skin and muscle all the way down to the bone within just days, if given the right conditions. Next up would be ants and beetles, which, like the flies, would be attracted to the smell of decomposing flesh and would be able to do their work on any part of the body softer than bone, stripping away cartilage and fat with ease and entering the body through any available orifice, be that an opening in the flesh or any of the body's pre-existing entry points. Of course, on top of all this, outside of the boats, Mithridates would be constantly bothered by midges, mosquitoes, wasps and bees, all of which attracted by the sight of a free meal, be it in the form of blood or honey. And then, of course, what the historical sources aren't able to describe, because they didn't have the medical knowledge at the time, was the damage done by bacterial infection and internal decay, causing even more bloating, the liquefaction of organs into mush, and the early stages of sepsis, which again would attract even more insects and maggots in a vicious cycle of decomposition and rot. Blowflies laid eggs in his wounds, maggots chewed through his flesh, carrion beetles burrow beneath his skin, and his own gut bacteria, freed by infection, began to digest him from the inside. And it was that would finally kill the victim after day upon day upon day of the forced feeding, the hot sun, and an ever-increasing number of insects and other putrid events. The victim would slowly rot and be eaten, turning from a man into a liquid mess by the end. To quote Plutarch again, "When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon and, as it were, growing to his inwards." In this way, Mithridates, after suffering for 17 days, at last expired. Now, when I was first reading about this, my first thought was that why didn't the victim just try and rock the boat in order to try and flip the chamber over, causing a much faster death by drowning? After all, these boats would have had to have been relatively small if they allowed for your limbs and your head to stick out of the sides, so it must have been possible to flip them. And this is where I think we might be getting the boats wrong. See, in all of the pictures I've been able to find, the boats are left on the water, giving the impression that the entire time the victim was floating. But I don't think this is accurate. None of the historical sources mention that the boat was floating. It's not in Plutarch's description, and it's not in Zonaras's either. My guess is that the boats were probably placed in a small ditch or hole in the earth, so that no matter how hard the victim thrashed, their fate was inevitable. Plus, if the boats were to be on land, not the water, then it stands to reason that it wouldn't just be flies and maggots that could get to the victim, but also rats and ants' nests, which could work their way through whatever took their fancy. Now, before you go to bed with too many nightmares, there's actually some pretty convincing arguments to be made that scaphism, that is the death by boats we just covered and the death of Mithridates, may have actually never happened. See, Xenarus' description is thought to come from the Greek historian Ctesias, who has a reputation for exaggerating and sometimes just making things up about people he didn't like, and the Persians were one of those groups he might have wanted to paint as especially cruel and violent. Again, Plutarch, the main source that we have, is also writing this about 500 years after it all went down, and he also was not above the odd exaggeration when it suited him to paint a picture in the reader's mind. There's also no archaeological evidence of the boats, no carvings, no illustrations, no grave sites. There's also no records at all of its use. And the Persians left behind plenty of stories about mass crucifixions, impalements, beheadings, and so on. They weren't at all shy about being nasty when they wanted to be, and a punishment as brutal as scaphism would probably be done to send a message, and so it seems unusual to me that they go through all this cruelty just to send a message and then not actually record that message. In fact, scaphism may be more Greek than Persian. See, the word scaphism actually comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning trough or boat. So, if the Greeks didn't get the idea from the Persians, who did they get it from? And the answer to that question is themselves. You see, there's a close cousin of scaphism, another brutal form of torture involving a controlled rotting of the victim called siphonism, which had been practiced in Greece for quite some time, and the process involves tying someone to a stake, slathering them with honey, and leaving them for the insects and pests to pick apart. Sometimes the victim would be allowed to go alive after a day or two. Sometimes they'd be put out of their misery after a sufficient period of time by being taken off this stake and thrown over a cliff. And then, of course, if they've been really naughty, sometimes they'd be left to go and rot all of the way. And perhaps, just perhaps, scaphism was actually the brainchild of a Greek mind, taking this already horrifying punishment to its absolute worst extremes. Either way, it's all pretty grim stuff. It's the 10th of April 1905. We're in a market somewhere in Beijing, the capital of China, under the closing years of the Qing dynasty. A crowd has gathered to watch a scruffy young Mongolian man named Fa Chu Li as he's marched to his place of execution, where he will suffer one of the worst deaths imaginable as he is taken apart inch by agonizing inch in a process known as Ling Qi, which translates literally to lingering death, or perhaps more popularly called death by 1,000 cuts. The man has been accused of murdering his own master, the prince of the Aohan Bana in the south of Chinese-held Inner Mongolia. The story goes that this Mongol guard had taken up arms against the prince after he tried to take advantage of his position and forced himself onto the guard's own wife. Fa Chu Li was acting either to protect his family or exact his revenge. Whatever the circumstances may be, though, the crime itself is utterly shocking. For the Qing administration, it's a clear-cut case of Shi Jun, the slaying of one's own lord, known more formally to us as regicide. Under the Confucian Code of Ethics, violence against a master, father, or emperor were all considered to be unthinkable acts that disturbed the natural harmony of the universe and invited chaos into the realm. This means that no matter the details, the crime of regicide falls under something called the 10 Abominations, acts that were considered so evil and unnatural that they affected not just the victims, but nature herself. And in Chinese law, someone found guilty of one of these 10 abominations would be subjected to the worst punishments available and could not be pardoned or excused, even by the emperor himself. For Fa Chu Li, the consequences of murdering a superior were about to become very real. The Mongolian princes demanded that Chu Li be burned alive for his crime. But since the emperor at the time, Daizong of Qing, found this form of torture too barbaric, it was switched out instead for Ling Chi. However, Ling Chi was considered so cruel and inhumane that it was actually slated to be banned within 2 weeks of Chu Li's death. And so the board had to move quickly to make sure he received this sentence before they missed their chance to inflict the maximum suffering possible. And so Chu Li was sentenced to undergo Ling Chi, death by 1,000 cuts, on the 10th of April, 1905. The process began by tying Chu Li to a wooden frame so that his arms are tied behind his back and his naked body is exposed to the crowd and the executioner. Then an extremely sharp scalpel is used to take off chunks of flesh, one slice at a time. First, they would start with the extremities, taking off sections of the thighs, calves, forearms, fingers and biceps, before slowly working their way inwards towards the body, stripping away the intercostal muscles to expose bare ribs, and beginning to amputate entire limbs as the victim slowly fades in and out of consciousness. To quote Sir Henry Norman, who recounts the process of Ling Chi in his book The Politics and People of the Far East, the executioner, grasping handfuls from the fleshy parts of the body such as the thighs and breasts, slices them away. The limbs are cut off piecemeal at the wrists and ankles, the elbows and knees, shoulders and hips. Death would be put on hold for as long as possible, and when the executioner sensed that his victim was beginning to expire, the blade was plunged into the chest and through the heart. We don't know how long Chu Li lasted, but it's reasonable to assume that death did not come quickly for him. However, once he finally passed, the ordeal would still continue as he was removed from the stake and the scalpel was swapped out for a sword, which was used to further hack the body until he no longer resembled a person, but instead a pile of constituent parts smited away from one another. We know all of this because it's one of the few public executions involving torture that we have actual real photographs for. What? Obviously, I can't show you them here because they're way too graphic for YouTube, but they're not hard to find. Be warned, though, they're extremely unpleasant and disturbing. Don't go looking for these if you're sensitive. Do yourself a favour and just take my word for it. It's debated who took these photographs in the first place, but it was most likely a French soldier stationed in Beijing during the ordeal. One thing that's not debated, though, is that these photographs shocked the international community, and to an extent, they forever immortalised Ling Chi as a barbaric form of torture from the Far East. However, all human civilizations have had their ways of inflicting cruelty on others, and despite the controversy this caused on the international stage, let's not forget that China was already scheduled to do away with this punishment, as we mentioned earlier. So, on the 24th of April 1905, this abolition was made official, and Ling Chi was banned as a form of execution. This meant that Fo Chu Li should have been the last ever case of someone being subjected to this end, and although he was the last official case, the horror would continue, with one unconfirmed case involving a soldier in 1907, and some shaky accounts that Ling Chi had been performed as late as the 1920s and 30s during China's turbulent unrest. But even if Chu Li was the last, he certainly wasn't the first. Forms of Ling Chi had been around in China since the earliest emperors, and some say it was used as early as the 9th century BC. But it wouldn't be codified as a legal punishment until the 7th century AD under the Tang dynasty. And although it was used from time to time then, it would still take a couple more centuries before it started to take centre stage in Chinese crime and punishment, which we'll get into shortly. Part of the reason that the use of Ling Chi has its peaks and troughs throughout Chinese history was that it was always seen as an immensely controversial form of punishment. See, to Western observers, it just looks like a very cruel and nasty way to extend someone's suffering for as long as possible. But for Chinese culture, there was an added level of horror that's often lost on us. This is a bit of a simplification, but what Christianity is to Western thought, Confucianism is to Chinese thought. And under Confucian ethics, the integrity of your physical body is a really, really important part of your moral and spiritual existence. To quote Confucius directly, The body, hair, and skin are received from one's parents. One must not injure or wound them. This is the beginning of filial piety. So, by subjecting someone to Ling Qi, you're not just subjecting them to immense pain, but you're also turning them into something less than human. You're severing their connection to their ancestors and family by mutilating their body, and you're denying them access to the afterlife as a whole person, because now they're in little chunks. It's not unlike the process of being hanged, drawn, and quartered in medieval Europe, where the goal is not just to exert power and inflict physical suffering, but also to punish them in the next life and reduce their memory and legacy to one of degradation, indignity, and humiliation. For this reason, several attempts had been made throughout China to try and ban its use. One under the 9th century Emperor Shi Jingtang, although it was later reinstated, and then again in the 12th century when the poet Lu Yu wrote against Ling Qi, and his argument was as follows. When the muscles of the flesh are already taken away, the breath of life is not yet cut off. The liver and heart are still connected. Seeing and hearing still exist. It affects the harmony of nature. It is injurious to a benevolent government and does not befit a generation of wise men. However, try as these individuals might, the practice stuck around, and by the 15th and 16th centuries, it became a staple part of law and order within China. But the brutality of its use did vary, and scholars often disagree about just how savage the process actually was for the victim, since there was very little formalized detail on how it should be carried out. How bad it was really did just depend on the time, the place, and the crime. Some legal codes specify there should be 100 cuts before death arrives. Others say it must be 3,000, which seems a little high to me. And then, of course, we have lots of stories of the executioners taking bribes from the family of victims and, in exchange, giving them absolutely monstrous doses of opium or slitting them across.
There you are, fat ass. If you want to email her, you're more than welcome to, but she feels like doing something.